Excellent, yes. So, welcome. Let's get started. It's a great pleasure to welcome you at this webinar on global solar PV supply chains. And the question is, of course, Quo Vadis Europe? Where are we going, Europa? My name is Dries Akem. I am the director at Solar Power Europe. I will be your host and your moderator for the next 90 minutes. For those who don't know, Solar Power Europe is the main solar sector representation in Europe, with over 260 members covering the full value chain of solar PV. I have a series of distinguished guests with me today on this important topic. All of them are deeply involved in solar PV production in Europe and around the world, so you will certainly want to hear from them. Maybe to set a bit the scene first, if you go back a slide. The increasing geographic concentration of the solar PV manufacturing and supply chain challenges are prompting governments around the world to take action and to stimulate domestic manufacturing. Policy discussions have historically been more focused on the downstream, on deployments, with less attention paid to the upstream policy options to stimulate solar PV supply chain diversification. In May 2022, the European Commission presented its Repower EU strategy, including a first-of-a-kind solar strategy, renewing the ambition on solar PV deployments to at least 600 gigawatts by 2030, a doubling compared with the previous ambition. This was complemented, to our great delight, by an action plan for a new EU solar PV industry alliance, looking at supply chain diversification and aiming to bring back manufacturing in Europe to at least 20 gigawatts or more by 2025 across the supply chain. Recent international developments, however, in India and in the US, as we will hear, show that the global race for solar PV supply chains is on, and it raises the stakes for Europe on how to join and maintain its technological leadership in solar energy research. I would say the timing of these events could have not been better. Yeah? Hot off the press today, this morning, we saw a letter from Solar Power Europe, together with 12 CEOs, sending a letter to President von der Leyen and the relevant executive vice presidents and the commissioner, calling for additional action beyond existing instruments like the innovation funds and others, in order to make sure that Europe does not miss the boat in the global race for solar value chain. The CEOs call on the Commission to potentially also replicate the success of the EU Chips Act for solar. And also this morning, the European Commission formally endorsed the setup of the alliance to be launched at the beginning of the year. So yeah, great to see the timing, and I can also see from the attendance here that we're hitting in the spot of interest to the audience. So let's move on and let's look at what we will be doing. First, we will take a moment to understand the global solar PV supply chains as such. What are they? Where are they? And we are honored to have Paulo Frankel, head of the Renewable Energy Division at the International Agency, and Hemi Bahar, the senior analyst, and his colleague, to be presenting for us the state of play of the global solar PV supply chains following their report from July. And the second presentation from Leah Carpentier, head of the European Regulatory and Government Affairs at First Solar, to discuss on the latest developments in India and in the United States. After that, we will turn to Europe with the panel, and the panel discussion consists of Jacek Tuchycki, Deputy Head of Unit at DG GROW, European Commission, Ignacio Asenjo, Policy Officer at DG ENER, European Commission, Javier Sanz, Thematic Leader Renewable Energy at EIT InnoEnergy, Dr. Christian Westermeier, Vice President for Marketing, Sales and Application at Wacker Polysilicon, and Dr. Moritz Borkman, Chief Commercial Officer at Meyer Burger. So that's for the panel discussion. But without further ado, I'm happy to pass the word on to Paulo and Hemi to basically run us through the slides. Maybe one more thing, if you go a slide back, I should say that as an audience, you are able to ask questions. So you are able to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the bar. It is, of course, we have 90 minutes and a great set of speakers, so I shall manage expectations to the extent that we can pick up on your questions, but I will certainly do my best. So please don't be shy to pose your questions. If we don't manage to pick it up now, we may actually follow up with you later. That is, of course, also possible. Very good. So without further ado, I'm handing over the word to Paolo and Jaime from the International Energy Agency to present their slides on the state of play of the global solar PV supply chain. Thank you. The word is yours. Paolo, can you hear me?
Yes, but I could not unmute the audio. So,
oh my God, yeah. So
can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly well.
Okay, but I have another problem. I cannot see. Yeah. Anyway, can you, Chiara? Can you put the slides and give me the power to change the slides?
Is that working for you, Chiara? Yeah.
Yes, I have control on my screen, but I see myself and not the slides. So wait a second.
You have to work with view options maybe on your end. Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, well, what can I say? Okay, let's see whether I can do it in this way. Wait a second, let me see. So I'll try my best. Sorry, but this is exactly what I... Now, thank you for inviting the IEA to summarize, and I will summarize some of the few main results of the special report on solar PV global supply chains. I will be joined later by my senior colleague, Jaime Bahar, who is the main author of this report. Jaime has a private issue, so he's joining later. He will be important to answer all the difficult questions that I'm not capable to respond. But very quickly, as you know, the IEA is about energy security. We were found about this in oil security 50 years ago. Now we cover also gas security, electricity security, and more recently, critical minerals and supply chains. And our first detailed work on supply chains was precisely on PV. Now, the first point that we would like to make is something that, of course, you know very well. From 2010 to 2021, the Chinese policies have really enabled massive economies of scale, have also supported innovation, and as a result, cost of PV have declined for more than 80%, and PV has become the cheapest electricity generation source globally. This is very good news. The less good news, or if you wish, a little bit a major of concern, is the concentration of these supply chains, which can very well seen in the graph on the right, which is basically all red, apart demand, which means that China in 2021 allocated most of the different supply steps in the supply chains of PV. Now, one point that we did is about the environmental performance. If you wish, PV is subject to the same question that we often hear about electric vehicles. Since they are in China, this is based on the Chinese mix of electricity, which is based on coal. Therefore, actually, the environmental performance is not good. Now, I wish to be very clear, the environmental performance of solar PV over the life cycle is very, very good, and I will show in 1 minute. Of course, it is true that if you look at the mix of the electricity for solar PV manufacturing, it is more coal intensive because it's basically in China than the average global mix. And as you know very well, 80% of energy consumed for PV manufacturing is electricity. And if this happens in China, this is mostly coal. Now, as a consequence, the absolute emissions, no surprise, have increased from 2011. But what is more important is that the emission intensity, so the kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt, have been going down massively, have been actually halved, thanks to the innovation and better material efficiencies and energy efficiencies over time. And so what really matters is the kind of measure that we have used as an indicator, the CO2 payback time. And even if these PV modules are done in a coal-intensive mix like China, the payback time of these systems, of these modules, is between 4 to 8 months in the majority of the countries in the world. So basically, this is the time which is needed to repay the CO2 emissions that were caused during the manufacturing of PV. It's a very good performance if you think that then the lifetime of PV is from 25 to 30 years and maybe even more than that. This is just to clarify, because we sometimes have still people that look at the life cycle of PV and raising questions. The other thing that we looked at is the trade values. And the trade value, the PV international net trade value, has reached a new record of almost $50 billion in 2022. To some extent, this is driven by higher prices in 2022, but this is a new record. What is more striking is in particular the value, not just the absolute value, but the percentage value of trade of PV on trade balance in different countries. And it is 7% in China, is 10% in Malaysia, and 5% in Vietnam. These are huge numbers. And of course, if there are winners, there are also losers. Losers, of course, economically, and indeed Europe, US, and Indian solar PV trade deficit reached more than $20 billion in 2021 as deployment accelerated. So we are giving out, of course, money. The main concern, however, is concentration. And here I would like to go more in detail. The first thing is a concentration of the different part of the supply chain, polysilicon, wafer cells, and modules in one country, in China. If nothing changes, we hope it will change, by 2025, something like 95% of the concentration for the main steps would be in China. Second aspect, a concentration in a single province. In 2021, it was 40% in a single Chinese province. And in some cases, the single plant concentration more than 10%. Now, this is really a concern. This would be a concern for every supply chain, and solar PV is no exception. And here it is a concern because when you are at this level of concentration, if there is an incident, if there is a policy change in the country, infrastructure failures, this can lead to global disruption. And actually in 2020, a technical incident at a single facility reduced the global polysilicon manufacturing capacity by 8%, which is huge. So a big concern for this concentration. Now, going forward, we know that solar PV will have to develop much faster. It is already the fastest energy, not just the renewables, energy technology deploying in the world. 2021 market was 150 gigawatt. We estimate 2022 to go up to 200. But to be in a net zero scenario for the world, the IA estimates that the annual new installations by 2030 should be 4 times higher. So at least 600 gigawatt by 2030. This obviously implies a much bigger manufacturing and new opportunities, new challenges, but also new opportunities. First, an opportunity of a double investment. This includes, of course, the reduction of the cost and the economies of scale, and also a big opportunity in creation of jobs, which is something what is very important for policymakers, with the perspective to have an employing 1,100,000 people in the PV manufacturing globally by 2030. Now, this is, of course, a big driver for diversification. And when I say for diversification of supply chain, I mean geographically in different countries on the world. However, we have to be conscious of important differences and gaps in the cost of manufacturing. Today, the only other region in the world which has comparable manufacturing cost, and here in the graph you see by the different inputs, is the ASEAN region, which is comparable with China. And otherwise, anywhere else in the world, the costs are higher. And given that we are speaking about and in Europe right now, the biggest cost is in Europe. Now, for Europe, the biggest source of this cost is the energy, is the cost of energy, which is the biggest gap. Otherwise, in some other places, also the cost of investments can be important, but it is important to keep in mind that what matters here is different financing situations, but also the OPEX, the operating expenditures. My last graph is recycling. Can recycling help? Yes, of course it can, but later on. And for an obvious reasons, which is linked to the flow of materials that can be recycled, taking into account a lifetime of 25 to 30 years and maybe even more. Anyway, by 2040, we estimate that there could be from 10 to 15 million tons of materials available for 2040. And in that decade, in the decade from 2040 to 2050, this could contribute massively for some selected materials. Important here, in particular, I would stress the importance of silver to reduce the necessity of raw materials, and that would bring both important environmental and economic benefits. Now, my last point, one of the recommendations of, we did 5 main recommendations at the end of the report. The first is really to raise to the attention of policymakers that the concentration of the PV supply chains are a concern for maintaining energy security everywhere in the world during the clean energy transition, and therefore the diversification of raw material supplies and manufacturing should become a policy priority. Second, it's obvious that there is a high risk associated with manufacturing investment today in PV because also of the cost gaps, and so we need a number of policies to help this. The third is to not forget the environmental and social sustainability as important criteria then to reflect the value of the PV that are coming from the different parts of the world. And I stress not only the environmental, but also the social sustainability criteria. Obviously, to continue to foster innovation everywhere, innovation has played a major role, apart from the economies of scale, in reducing the cost of PV worldwide. And the first is, even if this is coming later in the roadmap and in the deployment, to develop and strengthen recycling capabilities, thinking and planning already starting from now. I will stop it here, but of course we welcome any clarification on discussion questions. And as I said, we have the fortune to have the main author, who is Amy, who will be answering questions much better than me. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paolo, for running us through this excellent presentation, and indeed based on an excellent report that you published in July together with your colleagues, indeed, on the global solar PV supply chain. It's really the new Bible, the new reference point for anybody who's keen on understanding what's happening. Can I just maybe one question back to you from my side? when you were presenting the breakdown of the costs between different geographies and outlining that the energy cost in Europe is really what puts Europe at a disadvantage. What is the year that you were showing? Because I'm imagining it's probably not going in the right direction if you look at what's happening today. Is that correct, Paolo?
Maybe I can quickly answer this question. It's based on 2021 average cost. So you have a bit of higher, but if you include today's costs in Europe, the gap is even wider, obviously, because probably the energy costs are even higher. And we include here from the costs are presented here from the metallurgical silicon all the way to modules. So it's every step. That's why energy has a big component in our cost model.
Thank you, Jaime, and thanks for joining indeed as well. Excellent. Let's move on to the next speaker presenting some slides, and it is Leah Carpentier from First Solar. As Paolo mentioned already, there are developments around the world on this, and Leah will talk us through some of the most important ones in some of the most important geographies. Little tip, not China this time. Leah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dries. Chiara, can you move to the next slide? So I'm going to be very short and crisp. My idea of the presentation is to give context really for our panelists afterwards. So this is not the moment to get very granular, but I think a lot of things have been said and missaid about both what is happening in India and the production-linked incentives and the US on the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm trying to use some of the framework in the family of regulation that were referred to in Paolo and Jaime's excellent report from July to basically kind of flash them, give them that context, and then think about Europe in light of this. So just a little bit of a caveat, this is not meant to be exhaustive. It's more a scene setting type of presentation. So what does the Indian PV incentive space look like? You have production-linked incentives, of which the new generation has just been adopted next month, and I'll touch upon that in the next slide, which is basically about allowing PV manufacturers to bid for production capacity. And once they get selected, they're entitled to certain CapEx incentives. This was such a popular approach that it was very largely oversubscribed, and the budget went out before all the demand was met, which is why India is increasing the level of ambition starting this month. In addition to this, and you can say this is not specifically incentives, but it is a policy that impacts the environment in which you can have visibility on whether a manufacturing investment is viable long term. Obviously, India has adopted import tariffs, which were even increased last April. So you have 40% tariffs on modules and 25% on cells. In addition to this, there's a reflection to really incentivize domestic production. So the incentives you might be eligible for when it comes to deployment of PV panels and the creation of PV installations will also get a benefit if you use domestic panels. And there is even part of PV deployment that is linked with government procurement that is reserved for approved manufacturers, which tend to be obviously domestic producers. You'll see a little bit what some of those incentives I referred to before look like when it comes to deployment. You have financing up to 30% for utility scale, and then 40% for smaller rooftops and 20% for bigger rooftops. So all of this creates an environment where you have good visibility long-term on a growing market, an idea of, the fact that not all actors in the market are welcome. So you are dealing with a limited supply, which gives you more visibility as a manufacturer, and obviously CapEx incentives to make your plant viable and less risky. The next slide goes into a little bit more detail on what was approved last month. So this is PLI Part 2. So just to give you an idea, we are moving from a program that had about 600 million allocation to 2.5 billion, which gives you an idea of the increase in ambition. And the the Indian government seems to think that this plan should lead to a production capacity of 65 gigawatts, which works quite well with the objectives to arrive at 280 gigawatts of installed solar by the end of the decade at a rate of about 25 gigawatts a year. The incentives and the way they're built are focused a little bit on what it is and what types of investment the Indian government is eager to see. And following what Paolo and Jaime said, there's a big focus on higher up in the supply chain. India has a pretty good module manufacturing, module assembly infrastructure already. Cells is picking up, but they know that they need to increase their reliance when it comes to the earlier part of the chain. And just roughly speaking, to give you an idea of how PLI works in broad strokes, once you have been selected, you will be getting capital injections or tax credits for the 5 years after the plant gets commissioned. And then they assume that that kickstart will allow the plant to be successful and operational in a growing market going forward. I picked up this statistic in one of the articles I was reading to prepare for these slides, but the Indian government expects close to 200,000 direct jobs from solar and close to 800,000 jobs in indirect. So this is not really anything that we can afford to just import in and miss out the economic growth that is associated with it. So that was my very broad stroke scene setting on India. And I've tried to use the same model because you will see that it's kind of the same levers that are being pulled in the US approach, but just differently. Chiara, next slide, please. So what was adopted by the US last month in the Inflation Reduction Act? This is a far-reaching industrial policy. I will only talk about some of the key elements of the solar plan, but it touches on hydrogen, it touches on wind, it touches on e-vehicles, it touches on the structures for PV systems. It is a very far-reaching and all-encompassing law. And I must put a caveat here. The way the IRA works when it comes to the clean energy incentives is by amending the US tax code. So a lot of the things that everybody is talking about are subject to the release of IRS, Internal Revenue Service guidance, which is not due until next year. So there's a certain amount of conjecture, I think, from everybody in terms of how you will calculate these incentives exactly. But I'm trying to give you an idea of the lay of the land to the best of my ability with the information we have today, just to tell you, what it means for the context, that the EU is going to be thinking about its future in. So just if I had to simplify, there is one approach that is really about manufacturing and one approach that is about, the PV systems themselves. So you are looking with the production side of things and with the demand all in one. And you will have minimal amounts. And I will show a little bit what that looks like, because it gets pretty complicated when you get into the granularity of it, of what you might be entitled to as a minimum, what you might be entitled to if you do not use labor unions for your construction staff. You do not have the right apprentice policies associated with PV deployment. If you do not use, manufactured products that are made domestically, basically nothing is not allowed, but the size of the incentives will go up and down depending on whether you tick all of the boxes or not. And obviously that is, one of the main elements that needs to be clarified going forward. If you go into the next slide, I'll try using some of the big pillars, on the model of what I did with India, to just give you an idea that it is the same factories of policies, but a slightly different approach. When you're talking about the production incentives, and I go a little bit more into that in the next slide, you have to realize that there's really two approaches. One, so-called 45X policies, are really tax credits meant to maximize production. So whatever you produce, you will be eligible for a certain amount of cents per watt as a tax credit in return. 48C is a little bit more similar to what we're used to in the EU, which is you have a certain amount of funding that is available to certain eligible plants. And those plants can get up to 30% of CapEx if they are deemed as eligible and get certified for the scheme. Manufacturers cannot do both. They either choose to optimize what they're going to be getting in terms of tax credits for their production, or to optimize the CapEx grants that are associated with 48C. Obviously, all of this is happening in an environment where supply has been somewhat disrupted in the US, associated with a series of trade policies. So we're familiar with the 2-1 tariffs from the Trump era, which have been reconducted by the Biden era with a certain exceptions and additions. In addition to it, you've had a number of policies that are associated with Xinjiang, which have disrupted supply in the US, but also created more of an environment for the desire to really massively grow local manufacturing to make up for this supply, which is no longer available to the United States. And obviously, the two big names to keep in mind here are the withhold release orders, which are kind of managed by the US's Homeland Security and Customs authorities. And then more recently, since June, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which has obviously stopped a number of shipments from China from entering the United States. The domestic requirements are going to be, I think, something that's going to be quite fascinating and is going to need to be clarified in the times to come. But basically, if you're building a solar plant with domestic plants, so basically modules that were made in the US, inverters that were made in the US, structures that are made with US steel, you are then eligible for more tax credits than what is the standard line. And as you will see under the PV installations column, the rule of thumb is that if you're going for the investment tax credit approach, you're eligible for 30% if you use US steel and you follow the rules when it comes to using unionized labor. If you do not, you're still eligible for something, but only 6%. If you meet that 30% threshold and you build in a region that's deemed to be an energy community or where there's a lot of former coal infrastructure, at that moment you're eligible for 40. With domestic content, you're eligible for more. So it'll be very interesting to see how easy it is to maximize these incentives or not in practice once they actually come in, which is at the beginning of 2023. There's another approach, just like you can choose in the manufacturing side between 45X and 48C, you can choose a production tax credit as opposed to investment tax credit. And if I vulgarize to the extreme, and I apologize in advance to the project developers who spend a lot more time with the financing of these projects than I do. Production tax credit is very interesting if you have a plant that's going to have excellent productable and you really want to maximize. You know that you're going to produce a lot with that plant and you want to maximize and you want to get those 2.5 cents per kilowatt that go out, keeping in mind that this 2.5 cents will be adjusted for inflation, which in the current context is not negligible. If you're more concerned with the cash flow that will go into your project upfront, you might be more interested in privileging the tax credit approach in the ITC. If you go a little bit further, I'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into 45X and 48C and what it means, because I think that's the revolutionary approach we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the future of EU incentives in manufacturing. Next slide, Chiara, please. So this is what 45X is. It's a redeemable tax credit, which is very hard to comprehend in the US context. It's a cashback tax credit. So if you get more tax credit than you will pay in tax, you are eligible to receive a check for what you have not used, which is very interesting. You're entering the world where basically these tax credits are the various incentives per steps within the supply chain. The more you can accumulate those incentives. So if you're just doing modular assembly, you're only that includes all of these steps, then you're eligible for quite massive subsidies. The other aspect, which is very interesting, is just the visibility in time. These are tax credits that are valid for 10 years, which allow you to calculate very nicely a return on investment on the medium term for a plant, which again gives you good investment security, which is why you've seen quite so many announcements in the US since the IRA has been adopted. The 48C approach gives 10 billion, which is a not negligible amount of money for the plants that actually need more CapEx support. Between the moment you get certified as eligible, you only have 2 years to build. So you've got to have something that's, relatively quick to turn around. You're eligible for 30% of the CapEx. And again, provided you tick the boxes on the adders, you're allowed to 30% and not 6%, but 6% would be the bare minimum. And in the way things are written, it looks like it's really geared towards regions of the United States, which are poor, which might be eligible for some of the additional adders. So you might end up having a number of brownfield projects or projects in cold regions around the 48C, based on what we see of how the text is written now, but it'll be interesting to see how things develop. If you move on to the next slide, I am not going to go on details on this, but I want to illustrate it and give credit to another piece of very good work. This is what the ICT and PTC pictures will look like, and the PTC is the slide afterwards. And this is a table that is extracted from the very good analysis that the US Solar Association, SEIA, has actually conducted on the IRA. And you'll see the amount of subsidies change through time. You have the different approaches based on how many of the adders you can accumulate. And they've done a very good job just laying out visually what this will look like. So if any of you are curious and didn't get the level of detail you were hoping for from my chat, I will direct you towards this very good piece of work as a good way to visualize all in one place, the numbers that are associated with the IRA and what it can mean for project finance in the US in the future. With that, I really wanted to keep it short, and I'm very excited to hear the panel discussion. I hope these elements will help feed what is coming next, and looking forward to the rest of the webinar. Thanks for everything.
Thank you very much, Leah. That was very comprehensive, and I think you struck the right balance between vision and detail. Can I just ask one quick follow-up question, Leah, if I may, before you switch off your camera? So give me a bit of a flavor of what it is for First Solar to look at the Indian incentives and the US incentives. Like, what is it doing to your company? Give us a bit of a background on that. It's interesting, I guess. Yeah.
It's exciting times. I mean, I think India, so we made an announcement for plants that will start operating next year in Tamil Nadu. Vibrant markets, very well placed, and the policy measures just helped, with any kind of risk profile that's associated with entering into a new market, gave a lot of assurances. And to be honest, some of the PLI details were not as advanced as what we saw last month, and it was still sufficient for us to say, this is definitely worthy of an investment, and we think the return on investment will be good enough. We trust the Indian market and the commitment of the government here. So the investment decision wasn't taken lightly. It was a new market for us. We had to get familiar with all of this. I mean, we have an excellent team in India, which helped a lot. But I think the long-term commitment from the government and the willingness to pull on the different levers at its disposal and prove that this was a comprehensive perspective and vision in which we as a foreign company manufacturing in India would have our place, I think went a really long way to convince our executives and our board. The IRA is our, it's our home territory. So the announcement of a new plant after 3 weeks is kind of unheard of, but that's how far-reaching what was adopted by Congress last August is. this is something that is going to revolutionize the US solar market. And I think, not just us, all of the other companies that have made announcements know that the US solar market now is going to be very different from what it is that we were expecting prior to the Inflation Reduction Act. And it just shows the level of commitment I think everybody was waiting for. These are CapEx heavy investments. So you need to make sure that you're working in a regulatory environment where the governments are partners and they have the same long-term goals as you. And I think that's what we had, both in the case of the Indian and US developments.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for that additional information. Very interesting. Okay, so let's go on with the program and now move to the panel discussion. And basically, the pivot that we're doing is like, all right, what does this mean for Europe? Yeah, I think we need to take a deep breath after hearing the excellent material, but also this set of assertive industrial policies happening in India, US, and we didn't deep dive on China, but of course that's a more established fact. So let me now turn to the panel. First, we'll start with Ignacio Asencio from DG Ener, Jacek Trucinski, also from DG Grow, and Javier Sanz from the EIT, and then we'll have the colleagues from some Solar Power Europe members, Christian Westermeier from Wacker Silicon, and Dr. Moritz Borkman from Meyer Burger. So starting with you, Ignacio, and thanks for joining. I mean, as one of the authors of the European Solar Strategy, you have the overview, of course, on how fast solar needs to grow as well in Europe. To what extent can this growth, these deployments, uptake also be a driver or a motor for bringing back manufacturing to Europe? Ignacio, if you can give me a 5-minute response to that.
Thank you, Dries. It's a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I work in the European Commission, DG Energy, in the unit in charge of renewable energies, and in particular on solar. We launched the European Union Solar Energy Strategy in May this year as part of the REPowerEU package. And it just shows the conviction that in order to reduce our dependency on important fossil fuels, and in particular Russian fossil fuels, we count very much on the deployment of renewable energies, and in particular solar energy. And as you mentioned in the beginning, we have included there an ambition to have 600 gigawatt of solar panels capacity deployed by 2030. These are alternate current figures, so you can convert to direct current and go beyond 700 gigawatt if you want, compared to around 140 that we had in 2020. So that means to more than quadruple the capacity, because we think it's going to be a very important factor in reducing our dependence and decarbonizing our energy system. So there's going to be a big increase in demand. This is already happening this year, clearly. Even last year it was happening, but this year is probably more or less booming. We think one factor that will have a specific influence in demand for European manufactured products is the process of customization of solar panels in the future. So we are in a situation today largely influenced also by Chinese manufacturing, in which we have a strong modularity and a strong commoditization of solar panels today. That, of course, has a lot of advantages and adaptability to many different contexts, be it utility scale or rooftop of panels. But we see in the future that there will be new kinds of demand that are emerging, and in particular the integration of solar panels in other products, including the surface of vehicles, to have solar-powered vehicles, which is an emerging trend, or the integration in buildings to have building integrated PV. These are just two examples. The trends are very interesting, and of course, not all technologies are equally adapted to that. And it is, the closer you are to the customer and to the project, which are very specific kinds of projects that require customization, probably the better for the industry. So we think that these trend toward customization can help European industry in the future. And we have committed to issue guidance to member states on what we call innovative forms of deployment, including the forms that I've mentioned before. and other forms that constitute dual use of land, including, of course, agri-PV. So we hope that given this guidance, we can help to lift regulatory barriers to these innovative forms of deployment so that we can have an increase of those and we don't rely solely on utility scale deployment and rooftop-based deployment, but also other forms of deployment that will require new technologies. And before giving the floor to Jacek, who will present you on the specific initiative on the Industry Alliance for solar PV in the European Union, I wanted to mention also 2 other initiatives that were also included in the solar strategy and that affect actually solar panels and the sale of solar panels in the European Union. I refer in particular to eco-design requirements that we plan to apply to solar panels, as well as the energy labeling initiative. This is the first time we apply these requirements to energy producing products. It's only been for energy consuming products in the past. It will not be the last one probably, but we are proposing to do that, and the final proposal will come probably in the second quarter of 2023. We are still in a consultation phase. We think this is a very good initiative to ensure that the panels that we have are the most sustainable and apply sustainability requirements. And finally, regarding an issue that was mentioned also by Elea, and that has been noted by the US in the past, we have adopted as Commission in September a proposal for a regulation to prohibit the sale of products made by forced labor, to prohibit the sale of those products in the European Union. This can possibly affect the solar PV sector. I'm not saying that it's going to do, but it's a possibility because we know there are a lot of claims of forced labor being used in the production of certain solar panels. This is still a process that needs to be adopted by member states, this proposal, and then applied by certain member states if they want to apply it specifically to the solar panel sector. But this process is already starting in terms of proposal by the European Commission. I want to stress again that this proposal is not sector specific. It's a general proposal, but I'm just noting that that link has been made in the past. So we'll see if it comes up in the future as well. Thanks a lot. I'm glad to give the floor to Jacek from DG Grow.
Yeah, indeed, over to you, Jacek. So indeed, this morning the news hits that the Commission is announcing officially the Solar PV Industry Alliance. Can you give us a bit of a flavor on that? And if I may ask you to how do you think this will compare to some of what things we've heard from the US and the Indian side, or how do we need to understand the role of that alliance?
Thanks, Dries, and thanks for your invitation to speak this afternoon. Indeed, the timing is very interesting here, and also thanks for the very interesting presentations at the beginning of that meeting. So I would say that today, as Commission, we show that we are matching our ambition on energy and climate policies with an equally ambitious industrial policy. Today, the Commission announced that it endorses the Solar Alliance. And importantly, it emphasized that this is really oriented towards manufacturing scale-up. So we believe, we hear from industry that we can aim at ambitious objectives. We can aim at 30 gigawatts of production across the value chain by 2025. We have seen those assessments, and we believe that with the right kind of framework to support it, we can get there. So let me just say a few words on how we want to support that objective. The Alliance will be really, it will aim at bringing together all actors that impact that ecosystem. That means the European Commission, of course, the industry, but also member states and investors, such as the European Investment Bank. One of the work strands that we will work on is removal of bottlenecks to the production and the development of the whole value chain. So there we talk about, for example, regulatory bottlenecks at EU level. You know, what the Alliance will allow to do is industry to have access to policymakers and identify things that really are hampering the development of that value chain, be it, for example, import duties or lack of standards that foster innovation. when we talk about member state barriers, here we talk about the development of really gigafactories for the manufacturing of solar panels and their components, and that often can take a lot of time. So here also things that you can think of is fast tracking the permitting of certain of those investments, something that is in the competence of member states. That way we can impact that and speed it up. Second element that I would like to mention here, and I think it's relevant in the context of the presentations we heard before about the Indian and US approach, is about financing. So here we have a less, let's say, it's a more heterogeneous framework that we have in the EU, but it's equally attractive and something that if we put the right use, it can really help the industry. Here, I would like to refer to for example, the Recovery and Resilience Facility as part of the Repower EU package, which was tabled in May to, phase out the dependence on Russian gas. We have proposed to scale up financing through that facility with 20 billion euros. And importantly, for the first time, one of the key objectives mentioned in that program is the manufacturing of clean energy technologies and the whole value chain there. And so what we intend to do is match those objectives with a project pipeline that is already out there. And we will work through the alliance to ensure that member states, when they receive the financing, get guidance from us on what type of projects for solar manufacturing could be supported there. Second element, the European Investment Bank, it has a very big firepower, but so far was reluctant to support manufacturing of solar panels and components in the EU. What we have to do is to give certainty to the European Investment Bank that this is a key policy priority for the EU. And I know, I used to work with the EIB. I know that, once something becomes an objective of the EU, the EIB is more willing to provide financing. And the third element I would like to mention here are those important projects of common European interests, something that has been deployed already for batteries. And we know the results of the Battery Alliance with a huge scale up of production. I know that the industry is working on an IPCI for solar. I think we have to speed up that work because there also, I think you have a good framework to mobilize significant financial resources from member states in a cooperative approach across the single market, because there you can use really the economies of scale and so on. If you look at the Batteries Alliance and the IPCIs there, it's 6 billion euros of subsidies, totaling 20 billion euros of project value. So here we already reach significant resources. And the third element I would like to mention here is working with the off-takers. In the EU, we still believe in a level playing field. We will not have something like Buy American, but we believe that we should give credit and the right value to the elements of PVs that we, where we believe that not only the European industry is strong on, but also that correspond to our environmental objectives. And so we will be working with off-takers, public off-takers and private off-takers to ensure that in their orders, they factor in the environmental performance of products. In November, we will be launching a big buyers initiative, and through that initiative, we will provide training and assistance to public authorities across member states to buy environmentally friendly PV panels. We will also work with DG Energy on guidance for non-price criteria in auctions. Here we talk about, utilities when they develop utility scale PV plants. That those auctions are not based only on price, but also on other criteria such as recyclability, durability, and so on, all elements on which we believe the European industry excels. So I would stop here, and I'm looking forward to the further questions and debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacek. That was very clear and a very comprehensive overview. Much appreciated. I'm turning to the next panelist, to Javier. So Javier, yeah, EIT and Solar Power Europe, we've been working together on this topic for many years with this European Solar Initiative and even before that. So you have been at the forefront, let's say, of the business case and the investment pipeline in solar manufacturing in Europe. So can you tell us a little bit about what the state of play is? Do you see a positive momentum in Europe in solar PV? And therefore, do you believe in reaching the 20 or even 30 gigawatts targets by 2025?
Yeah.
What's your assessment?
Thank you, Dries. A pleasure being here. So first, before we jump into what is in there available for reaching those goals, let me frame it a little bit. So you are right. I mean, we were teaming since February 21st when we launched the European Solar Initiative, and we have to congratulate all of us for the announcement today, because I guess the European Solar Industry Alliance that was announced also by Jacek before is going to be a very relevant tool for being successful in this endeavor. So let's frame it first. I think first we have to acknowledge that we want to reach 30 gigawatt of production capacity in Europe, but we are starting from a point that is very low. So all in all, I would say that in average we have a 2 gigawatt capacity, even from polysilicon, because the current polysilicon, and Christian will tell us later, as they have no European market, they are selling abroad. So that means that if they have to serve a new capacity in Europe, even polysilicon will have to scale up. And this is affecting polysilicon ingots, wafers, cells, and modules. And then ramping from 2 gigawatts in average to 30 gigawatts is going to be a phenomenal effort. So the question, as you said, is, do we have something to build upon and to reach those targets? I think yes, and the pipeline of projects that are claiming to deploy capacity is well above this target. We don't know if all of them will succeed, maybe not, but I think we are above those targets. And just to bring some examples, because obviously we can only talk about those that were public. We have in Germany Meyer Burger, Moritz can comment on that, or we have Osprey PV, both all together at close to 10 gigawatts. In France, we have REC, we have Carbon, and we have an undisclosed project that is above 5 gigawatts. So all in all, all three projects are adding another 15 gigawatts. We have Greenland in Spain that is 5 gigawatt, and there is another one that is not disclosed yet in the order of 10 gigawatts. So if you start adding, we have MCPV in Netherlands that is adding another 10 gigawatts. So if you add all these figures, we are well above the target. And as I said, maybe not all of them will succeed, for sure. I mean, it's going to be complex, because we are going to face also phenomenal challenges like access to skill, access to finance, the supply chain. I mean, we are talking not just about the companies that are producing those components, but the sub-items we have to include in this production chain. So things like, for example, Norwegian Crystals in Norway that is building up a 6 gigawatt capacity of ingots is also important. So I'm optimistic. I mean, 3 years ago, people was calling me insane. Now we are just discussing whether it's going to be feasible to reach the 30 gigawatts or 20 or even below. But I mean, at the end, we are discussing how to do it. So this is a major step forward, and I'm sure that we will do it.
Thank you very much, Javier. Indeed, an upbeat assessment that is always very welcome. So thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, I also turn to the next speaker from Wacker, Mr. Dr. Westermeier. Christian, yeah, tell us a little bit what your perspective is on this question. Like, what is it that you need as a company, especially in the beginning of the supply chain, And yeah, do you see investing in Europe as a fertile ground?
Thank you, Dries, for being part of today's panel. It's a pleasure to provide the view of an industrial player here. So Wacker Polysilicon, as most of you may know, we have around 80,000 tons of polysilicon capacity, located 60,000 tons in Germany and 20,000 tons in US. So we are active in both markets. And this capacity translates into approximately 26 gigawatts of modules if we would use the entire capacity for that. We are actually the largest polysilicon producer outside of China. And currently the polysilicon from us is in very high demand. The customers really like our material. It's the main ingredient for N-type production, which is the wafer for TOPCon and heterojunction cells. This polysilicon is also produced in a sustainable way, and it has the lowest carbon footprint for Siemens-produced polysilicon around the globe. Our polysilicon has a carbon footprint which is approximately 50% lower than that of our competitors in Asia. The major raw materials for our polysilicon is electricity and silicon metal. Both ingredients amount for more than 2/3 of our cost structure. And so you can imagine that particularly electricity prices play a crucial role. And what you also may need to know is that polysilicon production, as well as ingot and wafer production, both value chain steps are already 100% electrified. So there is just electricity used to produce these two parts of the value chain. And both parts, polysilicon and wafer and ingot, are also very capital intensive. So particularly for polysilicon, if we talk about the substantial capacity expansion, we talk about a multi-billion euro investment. And for such an investment, we of course need a solid case to go for an investment. And beyond financing, which you can imagine is a topic for such a huge investment, also OPEX support plays a crucial role. And I think we have seen from Paolo's presentation that electricity at the moment in Europe is just too high compared to the other regions. And this is already a problem for the current production of polysilicon or wafer ingot manufacturing, not to mention how this would play out for future investments. Because if CapEx and OPEX does not go together, an investment would be extremely difficult. Of course, we appreciate the movement of the European Commission towards an EU solar strategy and identifying solar as a strategic pillar for the Green Deal, also putting out ambitious deployment targets. But the problem is, while we move away from fossil dependency, we move now into another dependency when it comes to PV products and manufacturing, because currently Europe does not have a lot of PV manufacturing in place. It's not about turning back the globalization, don't get me wrong, but we need to have a fair share of EU production in the global PV supply chain. I think this needs to be a target. Currently, when I look into the EU solar strategy, but also in this solar alliance, which comes up now, for us, it's still a little bit vague. We cannot really deal with it. I think we need more meat to the bone here. And I'm a little bit concerned that the precise and tangible schemes we have seen in India and US somehow overtaking the EU effort. And I'm really concerned that EU may miss the train here. The US has brought out very attractive, let's say, measures which attracts investment. So coming back to your question, Dries, what would we need? As I said before, we have around 80,000 tons of capacity. And you correctly said, at the moment, there is no ingot and wafer customers in Europe, or at least very small ones. We also do not see a lot of projects in the ingot and wafer area. So at the moment, for us as a polysilicon manufacturer, there is no market in Europe. The same is true for US. So most of the material currently goes into Asia. And if you look into a new investment, so of course we would be prepared to go for an expansion of polysilicon, but this needs to be founded on a, let's say, solid business case. And as I said before, it's CapEx and OpEx. And when I talk about OpEx, it's electricity prices. They are just too high in Europe. And this makes it extremely difficult, particularly if you would like to build an investment case for the next 10 years, you need to have global competitive electricity prices in a stable form. Otherwise, this is very, very difficult. As I said before, 100% of the production is already electrified. And so a faster and more deployment of PV or wind or renewable energy would help to get our products even better in terms of carbon footprint performance. So here, this would be also very helpful if we could push that and also enjoy then automatically from renewables cheaper electricity prices, because this goes hand in hand. But this needs to go fast. And so when I talk about large-scale manufacturing in Europe and how we can get that forward, so if we would like to achieve 30 gigawatts by 2025, we talk most likely about 30 billion euro of investment we have to do in the next few years. And 30 billion euro is not a lot compared to what we spend in other topics. And so when you mentioned IPSA as one of the possibilities, IPSA is a good tool for innovative companies and scaling up. But for an already existing commodity, the IPSA fund will not help us in a very efficient and fast way. Here we need to find other tools. And whether the EU Solar Alliance is the right tool, this needs to be seen. All what is about is speed and really tangible results which an industry company can work with. That's what I think is mandatory for the companies in the PV supply chain to get really confidence into an investment which we would like to establish, helping the EU to achieve its targets. So thanks a lot. That's from my side. Happy to receive any questions.
Thank you, Christian. This was really excellent, and I really like the way you also described this kind of mutually reinforcing motor of decarbonizing electricity, solar and wind, helping with the carbon footprint of the solar, as well as actually helping with cheaper electricity prices. So that sounds like a win-win. Yeah. But thanks for setting it out. I'm moving up to the solar PV supply chain and passing on the words to Moritz Borgman from Meyer Burger, especially let's say expert in the needs from a cell and module manufacturing point of view. Moritz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dries, and good afternoon. Very, very happy also to be a participant on this panel, and honored to be here with my co-panelist, and also very pleased to follow on Christian. I can also say that we love Wacker polysilicon. It's a great product, and it's in all of our solar cells and solar modules. So a quick word about Meyer Burger. So Meyer Burger is currently the largest solar cell and module manufacturer in Europe. That sounds large, but in fact, it's still pretty small. So we are currently operating 400 megawatts of capacity. And as we speak, we're ramping up more capacity so that we'll be at around 1 gigawatt of capacity at the end of this year. We are pursuing a quite unique approach globally. So we have a captive strategy. We make solar cells, we make solar modules, but we also make the equipment for making solar cells and solar modules. And we have our own proprietary technology. And that is very unique. Probably First Solar, and Lea's on this call, is the only one that comes close with a totally different technology, of course, but also a proprietary technology approach. And with this technology, we are at the top of the market in terms of performance. And we have quite successfully, I would say, entered the market in 2021 and have ramped up our capacity at record scale. Meyer Burger has a very long history. we tend to say we're a 70-year-old startup. So our history indeed goes back to the 1950s, and we were an equipment manufacturer before we actually took the bold decision in 2020 to become a solar cell and module manufacturer, even before solar PV manufacturing was all the rage. And so I would say that probably we were even a little crazy at the time. Sometimes it takes crazy people to make things happen. But we're very happy to hear that these days it is, there's a lot of momentum behind solar manufacturing. When I think about what we make out of the current environment for PV manufacturing in Europe, so first of all, we believe what is absolutely crucial that we get to scale here in Europe. So we're now looking at a solar PV industry that is globally at 200, probably 300 gigawatts or even more of capacity. And I just talked about what capacity level we have, and we're already the largest in Europe. So it's just absolutely minuscule. We're absolutely subcritical, and we need to come to scale very fast. And that should really be the guiding motive behind all of what we do here. And so what it requires is very, very tangible support. And in that, I can only echo what Christian said. And we absolutely hear, like the words that we hear from the Commission, we need to see whether the actions are sufficient, because we are now in an environment that was already difficult before some of the recent changes in the US in particular. But now it's become even more difficult in a sense that it makes a lot of sense to invest in the US, but currently it is simply not attractive comparatively to invest in Europe. Meyer Burger, just as Wacker, is a global company. We have a footprint in Europe, but also in the US. In fact, we were the first to announce a US manufacturing expansion after the IRA was signed on August 16. On August 18th, we came out with our announcement. So you could say it took us 2 days to take the decision to invest in the US. We prepared a little before, but indeed, the IRA was a great booster for our decision to invest in the US. And the support there is just so concrete, so simple, so transparent, and so massive that it is very difficult for us in this current environment, unless things really change in the EU, to continue investing at the scale that is required. And so in that sense, when I look at the targets for 2025, 20 or 30 gigawatts in the EU, I would say that's too large and too small in a sense. So the ambition level is probably still too small when we look at what is actually going to be required in the mid to long term, because simply the demand, the European market is just going to be extraordinarily large, and we're going to look at 100 plus gigawatts of demand. And so if we are just targeting, say, 20 gigawatts or so, that's just very little. On the other hand, and in particular, with the current environment in terms of overall policy and economic environment in the EU, is, I think, going to be very difficult to actually reach those targets. And also would like to remind that it's not only about announcements, but about credible industrial players to actually execute projects. And so Meyer Burger has been in this business for 2 decades now in the PV industry. So I think can be said that we know what we're doing, but I can still say, sort of from the engine room, it's incredibly hard to build up an entire new industry. And so there's probably not many players that can pull it off. And we need all hands on deck essentially, but we also need the right support. And what I think is also very important from our perspective is to get the entire ecosystem running. So we not only need the core industrial functions, but also all the supply chain. We also need the skill. And I can even say that today it's, in some points of the value chain is even difficult to get the right people in Europe, because the value chain is simply really gone elsewhere. It's gone to Asia. And so we need to get all that back, and it really requires a lot of support. With that, I'd like to stop, and I'm very happy and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Moritz. That was very clear and comprehensive. Thanks for laying that out. So yes, so we've heard now from the Commission plans. We've also heard from the industry that there's signs to be optimistic. We see some kind of a pipeline, but then we also heard from companies like Wacker and Meyer Burger saying like, look, yeah, we are. It's just not attractive to invest in Europe right now. So there is this risk. How do we take this forward? So if I may just get back to the Commission, maybe to Jacek in the first place, when you think about the Solar PV Industry Alliance, are you thinking about this differently than, let's say, before the United States Inflation Reduction Act? Do you feel that the US action kind of raises the stakes a little bit and requires Europe or the Commission to do something additional to what it normally would have planned? How are you seeing that, Jacek?
Well, for sure, it's a big challenge for us because it will drag investors there, and so if it drags investors there, it drags them away from here. But there are still investors interested in investing in this value chain. I heard from EIT that recently there has been a flurry of new investments, and that in the current environment, because as Christian was saying, today we are in a very difficult situation in Europe. There is war basically in Europe. And if you look at other sectors, aluminium, it's down by 50% production compared to last year. So we are in a difficult moment, but we believe that this situation is exceptional. It will last maybe for the next 2 years. Prices will stabilize afterwards. And I believe that our approach is a longer term approach. And it's in a way, it's indeed, if you look at the subsidies, how concrete they are in the States, we don't have it yet for the moment here. But as I said, we have identified several work streams through which we want to also channel investments towards this industry. And we have Javier here on the panel. EIT has been extremely effective in developing a whole value chain for batteries. I believe we can replicate that for solar. We have to just pull the right resources. We have increasingly also momentum from member states to support that sector. Those issues have been recently discussed at the highest level by the ministers for industry from the 27 member states, which see this as a strategic objective to develop that sector. But as you rightly say, as the colleagues from the industry rightly say, now you have to, follow with concrete elements on that. And that's precisely what we want to do with this industry alliance. It will not be a talking shop for debating possible policy avenues, but it will be a very concrete initiative where you will notably match investors with project developers and see through under the rules that we have, because we also in Europe have a certain state aid rules that we must respect. So under those rules, how we can also help develop that project pipeline.
Absolutely. And maybe if I can indeed ask Javier also one follow-up question. I mean, we've seen the overview from India and the US with respect to kind of support schemes, but also with respect to some kind of import tariffs and all of that. How do you see that, Javier? Do you feel that there's a pipeline growing already? Do you think we need to also look at import tariffs? Is that a taboo at all within the alliance or within the EIT? Do you think it's needed, or you think we can manage, let's say with the right level of support schemes in general?
I mean, we think that this solution has to be drafted by all the players, all the stakeholders. So it's not about complaining what the others were doing or not doing. I mean, what is clear is that we are in an era in which there is a kind of battlefield beyond the Ukraine situation. We are in a battlefield for energy, and it's clear that other regions like India or US, and this was something that was shown by Leah before, are moving fast. So we have let's say a small window of opportunity, and I think it's not about just putting money or subsidies in there, but about creating a level playing field for all the stakeholders. Because if you look what we are ambitioning, I mean, the former NECPs were calling for 20 gigawatts per annum. The new REPowerEU is calling for 40 gigawatts per annum. But if we look what the industry is doing, probably we are going to exceed that. And 30 gigawatts is not going to cover totally the demand we have. So obviously there will be there is a need for imports beyond the capacity we can build, and so we have to ensure, if we want our own industry to grow and to succeed, is that we have an scenario in which competition is fair, and today is not fair. This is the point. So we have to find a way to make it fair for everyone.
Dries, can I add a small element there?
Of course.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, I have a couple of things to add here. I mean, of course, we are aware that electricity costs in the European Union are particularly high compared to some competitors. We are aware of that, of course. There are many reasons for that, but the main reason is that we have very high natural gas prices. And of course, there are a lot of discussions right now about decoupling natural gas prices from electricity prices. And we hope that this will improve in the future. We also have some initiatives for energy intensive industries to support electricity prices there. And we also know that in the medium term, electricity prices are going to go down. So maybe we have a bad situation right now that is linked to war in the continent and to fossil fuel dependency. But in the medium term, we know that prices are going to go down because renewables are going to dominate earlier than in most places in the rest of the world. So this is not a long-term concern. It's a concern in the short term, although it is a very serious one. I also wanted to mention the issue of international trade. Okay, so Christian mentioned that indeed we don't want to be protectionist, and I think we all agree on that. So if we don't want to be protectionist, that's also not calculate the capacity we need according to the demand that we have. We have a very strong demand in the European Union that is going towards 40 to 50, maybe even 60 gigawatt per year. We have a very strong demand in the US, we have very strong demand in India, we have very strong demand in China, right? It is not a question of what share of that demand we can cover here. It's a question of the European Union being able to innovate, to have a high performance product as Meyer Burgers and others, and to be able to compete in world markets and not thinking about what share of demand in the European Union we can cover, because most of that demand will actually be for standard panels and as cheap as possible. So what we need is to think global and to be part of a global interaction and a global value chain.
Can I respond to that, Dries?
Of course, Martz.
Yeah. So Ignacio, we, and as a manufacturer of innovative products, we certainly like what we hear in terms of support for innovation. That's great, and we need that. But we are firmly convinced that by simply insisting on the EU industry to continue innovating, we're basically just kicking the can down the road, and we're just trying to find some sort of pie in the sky scenario where magically we become competitive through innovation. So what we need to be aware is that we need the scale. And even as Meyer Burger, with an innovative product, we are struggling mightily to be competitive with the current entirely insufficient industrial ecosystem here in Europe and with the regulatory environment. And so what we need, I think that's very important to be understood, is we simply need very blunt support for scale up. And this also includes pretty boring mainstream technologies. We simply need the scale. And we are also not going to solve this by integrating PV in vehicles or doing RGPV or doing all kinds of BRPV. That's all good, and I don't objective, but that's always going to be complementary. And the bulk of what we need to do, and what is actually going to solve the massive energy crisis that we have in this continent, is to simply deploy very boring standard PV in large amounts in utility scale plants, on residential rooftops, on industrial warehouses, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we need. And we simply need to get, I mean, not simply, but we need to get sort of across the chasm in a sense that we are currently absolutely subcritical. We're not competitive. We need to get to the scale that we need, and we need to get the industry ecosystem back. And then there's no reason why the EU is not a competitive place to make solar. So we certainly don't want to create a subsidy monster that is just living off of subsidies long term. We just need the initial support so that we even can get there. I mean, currently we're just showing up to a gunfight with a knife, and it's not even a proper knife. It's a paper knife, and you know, that's just not going to cut it. So we need to get to the scale, and then we can be competitive.
Christian, thank you, Moritz.
Can I also make a comment?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So the 30 gigawatt, or the fair share which we should have in Europe as a production capacity, is something which we need to create some kind of resilience of the supply chain globally. It has nothing to do with trade, with protectionism or whatever. It's just a number which is thrown out and which could be achieved in the next couple of years if there is, let's say, determined support. First point. The second point, when it comes to electricity, I'm a little bit puzzled. Maybe it will take 2 years until electricity prices may be back again to the level we have seen before the crisis. But unfortunately, that's too late for many industrial companies. They will have done something different then to accommodate with the new situation. And just to give you a few examples, for example, silicon metal, which is one of our raw materials, some of the producers in Europe stopped production now because electricity prices are too high for them. They cannot afford them anymore. And as long as this situation continues, it will be extremely difficult for them to restart again, the longer it takes. Just to make you aware of what you are saying here, because some of these companies may then have disappeared by then. And then we do us a big favor because we just hurt ourselves.
Yeah, this is indeed quite a complex three-dimensional situation that we're in. Yeah, Jack. Yeah.
Yes, well, thanks, Dries. Just two observations. On financing, indeed, the situation is difficult. We are all aware of that. The Commission, at least my Commissioner, Breton, his line is that we have to do everything that we can to make sure that the industry stays in Europe in the current difficult period. Of course, the challenge is huge, and you have seen probably all the numbers. Member states are pumping something like 400 billion euros into supporting households and businesses. But we have to have a reflection, you know, together with member states and with industries, also where are our priorities, and you know, who should we really support in terms of certain strategic objectives during the current period. At least, you know, on our end, we have facilitated the rules, stated rules for providing that support to energy-intensive industries. Now, it's with member states to what extent they will use those opportunities. That's the first comment on financing. But the second comment I would like to make is that we really just reduce this discussion today to financing, and I think we should have a wider view at the wider comprehensive industrial policy, because I really believe that things like working with private and public off-takers, things like eco-design requirements for sustainable products, things like working on skills, where we also will have a dedicated financial support for developing training for the manufacturing of solar PVs and their components, will make a difference. So we have to look at the whole package and not just reduce this discussion to the level of subsidies.
Very good. Javier, you have your hand up, and then I'm afraid I will have to wrap up already, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Javier.
Thank you, Dries. I would like to elaborate a little bit more on what Moritz said, because I think it's quite important. Since the industry in Europe was destroyed in 2010, 2012, we in Europe have been continuously supporting the innovation. So if I compare this with the wind industry, the PV technology was supported even beyond. And I think this is not sustainable. If we don't have an industry, it does not make sense to invest in technology. So we have to build the building in the proper way, and we have to have an industry that is demanding this innovation. And we have a very small window of opportunity in front of us, okay? So we have to reconstruct the whole value chain. It's not about companies that are producing modules, but equipment manufacturers, suppliers of materials, anything. And this has to be the priority, not the innovation. We cannot hide behind the mantra that bringing something fancy into the market, we will recover the situation. We have to build up scale, because if we build up scale, we will rebuild the ecosystem. And we need that. If not, I mean, if this is not our top priority, we will lose again.
Absolutely, yeah. Very good. Paulo, I see your hand as well.
Thank you so much. The IAEA will continue to monitor all this in a rather, let's say, neutral way. I have to say, however, based on what I heard today, and in particular from the very clear statement from industry, I would reiterate from our side, creating scale is the most single important thing to do right now. And I think that given the very difficult situation of Europe in this moment, we collectively, and the IAEA is ready to support and to give advice, we really need to think out of the box on how to react in this extremely difficult and peculiar moment. Otherwise, I see a concrete risk that indeed the first investments go somewhere else, notably in the United States, in India, which in global terms is very good. Don't get me wrong. But as a European citizen, which is also looking at the jobs and the health of the European industry, this is a concerning thought, because then in 2 years from now, it will be even more difficult. And I think from the IAEA perspective, these needs, I hear, of course, very clearly the principles and then all the careful statements from the DG, from the Commission, and I fully understand that, but I think this is a really an exceptional moment which needs to have exceptional instruments, and I look forward to the Solar Alliance and to see how this can be translated in very concrete facts. And I can only confirm from what I heard from the industry, nobody wants to have subsidies forever. This should be really clear. But from the IAEA perspective, a pillar of the energy security is also a strong and clear industrial policy in areas which are considered as strategic. And here I have to really be clear, not all areas are the same. We really need to identify what areas are strategically important for the clean energy transition in the future. The IAEA will remain available to support by all means all the stakeholders and all the different policy sensitivities in this field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulo. And I believe that is a good note to kind of look at wrapping up this webinar. So as I mentioned before, I am aware of the questions that were posed. We are saving them and collecting them. I've also seen some of them have been answered in the meanwhile. Thanks, Amy, and the people from IAEA for doing that. I've also tried to keep some of the questions in mind, so in a follow-up, of course, but we will save them and get back to you on some of those, if that works for you. What rests me is to wrap up the session. So I think, yeah, we've been hearing new approach, we've been hearing scale, we've been hearing out of the box, and we've been hearing especially a lot of goodwill and good intentions around an aligned objective. So I think that's the takeaway that I'm taking today is that we have this will and interest and common objective of recreating a European solar PV manufacturing basis here in Europe. The Solar PV Industry Alliance will be launched later this year, so that will be a central venue for that conversation. And yeah, it won't be the last word in terms of what exactly we need to do, but let's continue the conversation and the cooperation, certainly in the alliance where Solar Power Europe will be likely taking a role as part of the steering committee as well, and with EIT and the European Commission work closely on this agenda. So let me thank you very much for sharing your expertise. It's been tremendous, lots of content, but excellent contributions. Thanks to the presenters, thanks to the panel as well, and thanks especially to the audience for being with us for that 90 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good afternoon, and see you soon again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice
Thank you.
day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.